All right, so we have obviously been reporting on the Israeli war in Gaza from the very beginning, including the October 7th Hamas attack that we spent the first week primarily focused on and arguing the reasons why you can't morally justify that attack. But for people who are now saying things like, well, it doesn't matter what the Israelis do either, that everything is game and fair and war, I always wonder what foundation they had for even condemning the Hamas attack at all. I mean, if everything is fair game and war, and that's your belief, on what basis can you condemn Hamas for killing civilians? Israel has killed 30 or 40 or 50 times the number of Palestinian civilians as the several hundred that were killed on October 7th by Hamas. And they've killed a multitude of that, not just after October 7th, but also before. And the argument is always, when it comes to Western wars, and this is a Western war, given that the United States is paying for it and arming it, is that the deaths of civilians is secondary, it's unintentional, it's tragic collateral damage, it's not what's intended. All you have to do is look with your own eyes at the kind of destruction that is now visibly apparent in many of the most densely populated parts of Gaza. And if this wasn't carpet bombing, if this wasn't an indiscriminate use of attack by air and by shelling, without the slightest regard for the destruction of civilian infrastructure and civilian life, I want to see an example of what you think is that, if this is not. Here is a photojournalist who just surveyed a part of Gaza. And look at this and you tell me whether you think this is remotely directed at Hamas or targeted at military targets or quote unquote terrorist targets, or if it's just indiscriminate destruction of the civilian life and civilian infrastructure in Gaza with the intent of rendering it uninhabitable, as many Israeli officials have said explicitly is the real goal of this war.
شوارع مبادة في حي الشجاعية، حجم الدمار هائل.
I mean, that is just complete destruction. Very few buildings standing, even fewer buildings standing that aren't irreparably damaged, that won't have to be torn down and reconstructed. There's no sewage, there's no healthcare system, there's no water. It's uninhabitable, most of Gaza, the densely populated parts of Gaza. And it's come from months now of just massive bombing. 2,000-pound bombs of the kinds that the United States stopped using in any areas where there's civilian concentration because the death toll is just too high for civilians to justify morally. And you look at video after video, and that's what Gaza looks like. And one of the many things that has made the violence in Gaza unparalleled in terms of recent warfare is the number of journalists who have been killed. Western journalists are not allowed to stay in Gaza. The only ones who have gotten in were ones that went in embedded under the arms and protection of the IDF and subject to its censors. That's what CNN has said its reporting is. It's subject to Israeli censors, even the reporting they do from Israel. And then you have propagandists like Douglas Murray who have gone in embedded for a day or two with the IDF and then come back. And of course, they were chosen for that because they were already so pro-Israel. Most of what we know in Gaza comes from two different sources. Number one, independent aid organizations, very brave people with organizations like Doctors Without Borders and UN humanitarian groups, UN hunger groups, independent groups that are involved in many wars, but every one of those groups is automatically accused of anti-Semitism in order to demean and malign any information that comes from them. And then you have journalists based in Gaza who also are accused of being Hamas propagandists and who have been killed in record number. There are more journalists that have been killed in Gaza since the start of this conflict just 3 months ago than were killed in all of the Iraq War. In fact, all the war of terror in just 3 months. And a lot of these journalists have been killed, not while working, but at home with their families. Entire families wiped out. Clearly, journalists have been targeted because Israel does not want the world seeing the reality of what it's doing. As the phrase goes, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Pictures like that are what Israel doesn't want the world to be seeing, which is why so many of the journalists providing those pictures are now no longer living. The Economist is a very difficult magazine to dismiss when it comes to Israel because they are and always have been vehemently pro-Israel, like most of the UK is. In fact, the official editorial position of The Economist since the October 7th happened is and continues to be that the Israeli war in Gaza is justifiable, that they have every right to go in and quote-unquote destroy Hamas. They have been defending Israel since the start of the war. So don't come and say The Economist is an anti-Israel or a pro-Hamas outlet unless you think that any magazine that prints anything that's incriminating of Israel automatically and inherently is anti-Semitic and biased. Only people who say positive things about Israel are to be trusted. That is a very poor way of picking and choosing which media outlets to believe. And ultimately, you shouldn't even believe in media outlets or disbelieve in media outlets as a general proposition. You should assess what they're saying and the evidence that they're providing for it and see whether or not what they're claiming is substantiated. In other words, you read everything with a skeptical eye. But for those of you who do first say, okay, which magazine is this before I should even consider it, The Economist, this is objectively true, editorially supports the war in Gaza by Israel. Here's The Economist from January 10th, just last week. The headline was, "Just How Bad Is It in Gaza?" As Israel is accused of genocide, we look at the humanitarian crisis. Here's what, and this is not an opinion piece, this is a news article based not on Hamas or Hamas agencies, certainly not exclusively, but all kinds of those other independent aid organizations that are risking their lives to be in Gaza. There were Norwegian medical teams that just entered Gaza to try and operate on children and brought medical supplies with them. There have been international nurses and healthcare workers who have been in Gaza and testified to what they saw there. Based on an amalgamation of these sources, here's what The Economist is reporting. Quote, "In Gaza, infrastructure has collapsed. Almost two-thirds of Gaza's hospitals are closed. The 13 still working are overflowing, with patients being treated on blood-slicked floors. They do not have enough supplies or staff. Desalination plants that once supplied clean water have shut down for lack of fuel and spare parts. Displaced children have access to just 2 liters of water a day. The UN uses the 5-step integrated food security phase classification, the IPC scale, to measure hunger. At phase 1, people are fine. At phase 5, they are starving to death, regularly skipping meals and often going 24 hours without food." Arif Hussein, the chief economist at the World Food Program, says that there are 706,000 people around the world at that worst level, that's level 5, actual ongoing starvation. 4 out of the 5 people on Earth who are in that level 5 starvation category, 577,000 are in Gaza. 577,000 Gazans are in level 5 of starvation. That is a quarter of the Gazan population, 25%. Not people who are on the brink of starvation, who are in the process of starving to death. Quote, "The scale, severity, and speed make this crisis unprecedented," he said. And we have shown you so many reports from all over the world saying that you have to go back to World War II to find a conflict, a level of civilian destruction this severe. The amount of bombs that have been dropped in a tiny little area in such a short period of time, the level of civilian destruction, 70 to 80% of civilian residential buildings are either destroyed or rendered uninhabitable. It is inconceivable how this population will survive, even if they physically survive whenever this war ends. Not just in terms of the trauma, imagine children having to live through this, but the ability to have a sustainable place to live. What percentage of the Gazan population will be dead at the end of this war? And if you're somebody who supports this, what percentage is acceptable to you? That is the question that I was asking of every Israel supporting guests we had on the show from the beginning of the conflict, what percentage of that in population are you willing to have die for you to say that this war is justifiable? Right now, 1% at least of the Gazan population, by all accounts, have been killed by Israeli bombs. 1%. So 1% of the people who were alive on October 7th are now dead in just 3 months. And by all accounts, this war is ongoing. And we're going to see over the next 2 months, 3 months, people dying in mass numbers of starvation, but also treatable diseases like infections because there's no antibiotics allowed in Gaza. Remember, Gaza is under an Israeli blockade. The Israeli defense minister announced at the beginning of this war that they will not allow food, water, fuel, or electricity into Gaza. And the reason, he said, was because they're, quote, human animals and need to be treated as such. They have now allowed a tiny amount of aid to enter a couple of different places, but nowhere near enough to even keep that population alive. And we're not talking here about whether the Israelis should be the ones providing this aid. No one is even saying that. What we're saying is the Israelis should allow international organizations in to safely distribute this aid so you don't have huge numbers of civilians, including children, dying in large numbers because of starvation and treatable disease. This is basic war legality and war morality. And if you don't believe in it, then don't object and call people terrorists when they wage war in a way that you want to somehow find morally reprehensible, because you're already saying you don't believe in this concept when it comes to war. And then there's a separate question of why the United States should be paying for this. Now, one of the arguments that I hear over and over, and in part because I'm a critic of Israel and the Israeli war, who's also a gay man, but it's a very common argument generally now in the West, not just to justify the war in Israel, but to justify anything the U.S. security state does, is to invoke the culture war in general, and in particular, LGBT issues. So it's a common argument to say that because Hamas is hostile and has a lot of antagonism toward LGBT, they kill gay people sometimes, they don't tolerate homosexuality, people who tried to be openly gay in Gaza would be killed by Hamas. Therefore, goes this argument, gay people in the West or people who care about LGBT issues somehow have some kind of like a moral obligation to identify themselves solely by their sexual orientation, decide that they're going to view the world through the issue of LGBT issues, even including geopolitical conflicts. That somehow if you're a gay person, you have to elevate the importance of LGBT issues, not just in terms of your personal political priorities, but the prism through which you understand wars. And you just kind of simplistically and reductively look at which side is better for LGBTs, and oh, that's the side I'm on. And if the United States or the West proposes to go to a war with a country that's bad for LGBTs like Russia, where we heard the same thing, oh, Russia's bad for LGBTs, they don't like gay men. Putin has introduced a bunch of oppressive measures against LGBTs and trans people. He doesn't like gender ideology. He's not in favor of gay marriage. Somehow that's supposed to mean that as a gay man, you're supposed to stand up and say, oh, now I support a war against Russia. Here is a TikTok video by a gay man named Daniel Ryan Spalding. In October of 2023, this went mega viral. And here's what he argued.
I think it's a little ironic that the people who seem to be defending Hamas online are also the ones they'd be most likely to kill. Oh, no, I'm sure the Islamic terrorists would love you, queer intellectual feminist. We're freedom fighters. They're fighting for their land, and I'm fighting for my right to purple hair. What the fuck? It's like a girl in a really toxic relationship. I know you don't like him because he kidnaps and murders people, but trust me, when I'm alone with him, he is such a sweetheart. I'm sorry, if your reaction to people being slaughtered, beheaded, raped, and burned alive isn't complete and utter disgust and horror, if your reaction is, yeah, but I mean, why? See it from their perspective. You need to get your fucking head checked, okay? I'm sure Jeffrey Dahmer had a rough childhood. That doesn't mean I empathize with him. If you want to free Palestine from Hamas.
All right, so a lot of conservatives love this little finger-clicking, neck-snapping, sassy video in defense of Israel. Let me just show you one part that I find very remarkable. Here, as I said, this went mega viral. Just this one part here. Listen to this.
such a sweetheart. I'm sorry, if your reaction to people being slaughtered, beheaded, raped, and burned alive isn't complete and utter disgust and horror, if your reaction is, yeah, but I mean, why? See it from their perspective, you need to get your fucking head checked, okay?
So what has been the reaction to 3.5 months of people being burned alive and bombed to death and children having their limbs torn apart and watching people get their arms and legs amputated with no anesthesia and watching 25,000 innocent people die, half of whom are women and children? Is it horror and disgust and all the other adjectives that he so sassily invoked? Or has it been, oh, well, we need to look at it from the Israeli perspective? As a member of the as a citizen of the United States, as a member of the West, as somebody who is on the side of the people who are waging more wars than any other country in the world, constantly finding ways to justify slaughter on a mass scale is something that the United States and the West do with extreme regularity. And then when we do it, our argument is always the one that's being condemned there, which is, oh, well, you have to look at it in the broader context. You can't just look at what the Israelis are doing over the last 3 months. You have to look at what happened on October 7th. You have to see it in the context so that you see it from the Israeli side. That's always the way wars are justified. But this broader point that because Hamas is antagonistic to or violent toward LGBT, somehow that compels gay men in particular to be on the side of Israel is one that I hear all the time. In fact, they have propaganda tours where they invite gay office holders and gay journalists from the West to go to Israel. It's a gay-specific tour of Tel Aviv. And people go there and they get shown the gay bars of Tel Aviv and the sex shops in Tel Aviv and get introduced to a lot of gay men in Tel Aviv, gay Israeli men. And they're told, look at how much gay life thrives in Israel, but in Hamas and Gaza, they kill you if you're gay. And a lot of gay politicians come back obsessed with supporting Israel and cheering Israel. That's what happened to Richie Torres, the Democratic congressman who got elected to represent the poorest district in the United States, the poorest district from the Bronx. And for whatever reason, known only to him and his team of, what I hope are his team of psychologists, only he knows why he decided, representing the poorest people in the United States, to prioritize the issue of Israel as one of his main, if not his main focal points of advocacy while in Congress. And he's a gay man and went on one of those gay trips. Now, one of the reasons why I find this argument so obnoxious, and here today I see it all the time, here's just someone who identifies as an America First advocate. I get these all the time too. They say America First, but then they yell at me if I say we shouldn't finance Israel, which is a foreign country. He said, quote, go over there wearing a pride flag and I'm sure you'll run into thousands of enlightened, totally innocent Palestinians. Book your trip. Because I was saying that a lot of people see this destruction of Gaza and the civilian death that has ensued and they don't pretend to object to it. They say, I'm happy about that. I support that because I don't think there's such a thing as innocent Palestinians. I was actually saying I prefer that candor to the people who deny the truth of what's going on in Gaza. I prefer the people who say, yes, massive numbers of civilians are being killed, and I support that, and I'm happy about it because I don't regard Palestinian life as being valid. And he decided to say, go to Gaza and see how gay people are treated. Now, one of the reasons why I find it so obnoxious is because I thought we're all supposed to be against this idea of identity politics, that you don't see yourself first as a human being. Now you're supposed to see yourself first as a gay man. And if you're a gay man or a lesbian or someone who identifies as LGBT, you're required to look at wars, not the way other people look at wars, through the geopolitics or the strategy of wars or whether they're morally justified under the laws. No, you have to prioritize gay issues somehow. You have to introduce LGBT issues as your prism for deciding whether or not you think a war is just. It's a complete non sequitur. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.